Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming back again. My name is Shannon. We are on chapter 16 of our 27-day devotional series based on the book, A Time to Dance, Chasing Joy in Difficult Seasons. If this is the first video that you're catching, we are going through this book chapter by chapter and just taking a bit of a deeper dive and talking about the topics and talking about how we can really apply it to our everyday lives. So I'm excited about chapter 16. Chapter 16 is the brokenness around us. And the reason why I think this is a really great chapter is that it not only was an incredible chapter in my healing journey, but it is also a chapter that I've continued to go back to over and over and over in everyday life because I found that the lessons that God taught me in chapter 16 were just life-changing in how I interact with others, how I see others, how I experience others as they go through their season. And it just was a beautiful chapter for me. So welcome. Let's dive right in. Chapter 16 is titled The Brokenness Around Us. If you've already read the chapter, you know what it's all about, but just a recap for those who may not have read the chapter. Chapter 16 is all about when you're traveling through this season, this journey of healing, you're chasing growth, you're chasing peace, you're spending a lot of time just focused on, I don't want to stay in this brokenness anymore. I want to climb out of this anger. I want to climb out of this anxiety. I want to climb out of this depression. I want to chase everything that Jesus has for me. I want to draw closer to him. I want to let him heal me, let him pour through me. And I really want to grow. And I say that very, very gently because one of the things that God has really been working with me through right now is that, when we think about a seed that's been planted in the ground, it's like, when does that seed know? How does that seed know when it's the right time to emerge from that dormant state? And I keep going back to God whispers into the seed that it's time. And I know there's a whole scientific background, behind how a seed knows when it's time to emerge. But I really felt like for me, when I was traveling through that very difficult and dark season, that, God, when it was the right time for me, he just whispered in my ear, it's time, Shannon. It's time. It's time to grow. And as I began to read about this, and it's really kind of exciting because some of this goes into the next book that I'm working on. But as I begin to learn about seeds and when it's time for them to grow, I learned that, when they first come out of that shell, the first thing they do is begin to create or grow roots. And that is the most vulnerable time for the seed right there is that moment that they first bust out of that protective shell and they begin to grow roots. And it's just so much a beautiful visualization of what we're all going through right now. Because if you've been in that really difficult season and you felt yourself in that dormant state, you know that the second that you begin to grow out of that, the second that you say, I'm ready to take that step into healing, you know that that's going to feel like the most vulnerable time for you. You know that that's going to feel like all these things that you've been protecting yourself with, all this armor that you've put around your heart, you know that allowing yourself to shed some of those is going to feel so vulnerable and it's going to be scary. And there is a lot of fear in taking that step. But if God is really whispering into you right now, it's time to take that step into healing. It's time to take that step into pushing forward. It's time to take that step into me. If he's whispering that in your ear right now, you can really trust him to protect you in that. And I just really felt like that was a word that I wanted to share with you today. And maybe that's because someone out there, someone who's going to be watching this video, just really needed to hear that word. And we're going to talk a little bit at the end of chapter 16 about, God's protection. But I just really felt like you needed to hear that today. So let's dive into chapter 16. Chapter 16, again, what it talks about is when you're walking through this season of healing, when you're walking through this journey, chasing Jesus, chasing God, when you are breaking open that shell and beginning to grow your roots into God, and you're really just beginning to take hold of the seeds that he's planting in you, and you're beginning to water them, and you're beginning to grow roots in who he says you are, which is something we've walked through so much in this series, growing roots in who God says you are, right? And you're beginning to grow, and you're beginning to come out of that shell. Sometimes one of the most challenging things about that place in your season is when the brokenness around you begins to make you shake, when the brokenness around you, when people in your life, and it may be people you love very, very much, are also traveling through a broken season. And some of that brokenness is seeping out onto you, and it's scary. It hurts. It makes you angry. It makes you feel misunderstood when you already feel like you're in this very vulnerable state where you're just beginning to break out of that shell. And that is pouring onto you. All the things that you're so used to protecting yourself with, you suddenly want to slap back on and say, I can't do this. I can't do this. I have to protect myself. And it's a very, very challenging part of the growing period because you feel very vulnerable, especially when it's someone you love, when it's someone you care deeply about, when it's someone who knows you well enough that maybe you're finding some truths in some of the things you say, and suddenly insecurity begins to wrap itself around you again, or maybe anger begins to wrap itself around you again. And it's just a very confusing place to be in your healing journey. And that's what this chapter is about. So I want to dive right in and really talk about what I learned, what God really taught me and poured into me during that part of my growing season, because it is vital that we learn this so that we don't allow it to pull us back into our shell. We don't just suddenly suck everything back in and say, I can't do it, because God's calling you saying, you can do it. You can, because I am with you. Just like he told Moses. Moses said, but who am I? How am I going to do this? And God said, you're going to be able to do this because I'm with you. And that's exactly what he's pouring into you today. Even if you feel like that the brokenness around you is causing you to want to curl back into a shell, God is saying, you can do this because I am with you. So I'm actually going to flip the chapter around, and I'm going to start with the end and go back to the beginning, because there's two big points that we talk about in this chapter that God really poured into me. And the first one really talks about grace and understanding, what that person may be experiencing. The second part is what we're talking about right now, is that need to pull that armor back on and protect ourselves. And the reason why I want to start there is because recently God poured a very big lesson into me. And it's been really neat as he's been walking me through and teaching me about this, because it deals with the story of David and Goliath. And it's a line in that story that, I've read the story a million times, but for some reason it just popped out at me, and God said, right there, that's what I want you to hear. And it's the very beginning of the story when David is getting ready to go out there and challenge Goliath. And King Saul, puts all his armor on David to protect him. And you got to imagine that this is a king's armor, right? So it had to be made by the best craftsmen available. And so it had to be just incredible armor that's meant to protect. And David said, I can't walk in this. I can't move. One of my favorite translations of this specific, because I pulled out all my translations and I was looking through them, and one of them says, I can't move in this. And then David took it off. And God just said, right there, Shannon, right there is where I want your heart to listen to. Because recently I had someone talk to me about a very difficult and challenging situation and season that they were going through. And they found themselves holding on to anger. And they said the reason when they got down to the roots of why they were holding on to that anger, it was because it felt like protection to them. Like they were protecting their own heart, their own spirit, by holding on to that anger, because they knew that anger would prevent them from putting themselves in a situation where they could be hurt again. And it's like, it's so I can relate to it so much because there are those times when you're healing and someone around you, the brokenness around you is seeping onto you, and you start slapping on those old familiar pieces of armor, anger, resentment, just things that you know, if I hold on to these, then I won't let that person or that thing come into my heart and affect or hurt me again. And when you're coming out of a broken season, there's so much of you that is about protecting yourself because you've been down that hole. You don't want to go down that hole again. And you begin to do everything it takes to protect yourself. But David, in that moment, he knew, he said, I can't move in this. And it's so telling because when we start slapping that armor back on to protect our heart, we can't move into what God's calling us into. David knew God was going to protect him when he went into that space where he was face to face with Goliath. In fact, the story says David ran into the battle. He didn't walk in shaking courage. He ran into the battle. And in the same way, God is calling us into this beautiful space of healing and joy. And we can run into that battle, but we can't run into that battle if we're slapping all this armor on to protect ourselves. We have to let the armor go, and we have to trust God to protect our heart. So if you're traveling through a season of healing and the brokenness around you is really causing you to kind of fall into some of those old habits of slapping that armor back on, remember that you are invited to trust God in that space, shed that armor, and run into the season that he's calling you into without all that weight holding you back. Because trust me, anger, resentment, fear, all of that we slap back on, it holds us back. And God is calling us into a space where he's saying, trust me in this, trust me to protect you, trust me that I've got you. So that is the first point. It's actually, as funny as it is, I flip-flopped the chapter. That is the second point in the chapter. But the first point in the chapter, let's loop to that real quick. Don't be surprised if this part of the chapter challenges you, because I found that the only way I was able to navigate truly through this part was through just a tremendous amount of prayer. It's just incredible what God can pour into you when you spend time, instead of trying to figure out how you can make yourself feel a certain way or make yourself act a certain way or make yourself approach a situation a certain way, instead of trying to, force it into fruition, you just take it to God and just ask him to let it pour into you. And the reason why I tell you that this may challenge you a bit more is because this second part is really about putting on our grace goggles. I know what you're saying. When you're traveling through a really difficult season and you're growing and you're healing and you're feeling, peace and hope and joy begin to pour into those spaces. And then the brokenness around you is seeping onto you, or let's just say it. Sometimes I call it what it is. Sometimes it just flat out gets vomited on you. When you are traveling through a season of healing and that happens, sometimes one of the hardest things to do is to put on our grace goggles. And I am not sitting here behind the veil of perfection telling you that I am wonderful at doing this. I'm sitting here telling you simply what God taught me when I was walking through my own season of healing. Because when the brokenness around you begins to truly challenge your own healing journey, you can find yourself questioning really everything. You can be questioning, God's promises. You can be questioning your ability to give grace. You can be questioning someone else's heart and casting judgment on it and saying, do they even deserve grace? All of those things can begin to really grow inside your spirit. And I would definitely warn you, because in that space, in that moment, the enemy loves to start pouring in anger and resentment and to start really wrapping us up in some of the things that God has been working to help us peel off. So, be really careful when you're traveling through your healing season that anytime you feel that surge, that you just take it to him and lay it at his feet, because he will be faithful to walk you through it. He will be faithful to pour in peace and grace and all of those things that you need. And the other thing too is that, we talked about letting God protect us. And this part of the video really talks about seeing that vomiting, if you will, as a symptom of brokenness. So seeing past the symptoms of what's being vomited on you and seeing that the other person is really going through a tremendous amount of pain or fear or anxiety, that truly whatever is being vomited on you is a symptom of what's going on inside of them. And I gave a really personal example of that in the book, of a time in my life when I just had an outburst of anger and rage all over an innocent party. And when I took a step back, God began to pour into me to recognize that that was a symptom of my brokenness, that what I was vomiting on them had nothing to do with them. It had everything to do with what was going on inside my own heart. And to begin to take that understanding and then turn it to be able to see the brokenness in others, to be able to see that their reactions are not who they are. They don't have the power to define them. They don't have the power to say how loved they are, how worthy they are. They're symptoms of brokenness that are going on inside of them. And so I was able to take my own situations, my own times of needing grace poured in, and allow that to change my perspective of how I see others. But there is a second part in that as well, that when we're able to identify the brokenness in others as being a symptom, it no longer has the power to impact me, impact us the same way that it did before, because we are reminded to solidly anchor ourselves in who God says we are. So when you're traveling through this season of healing, if there is brokenness around you that is seeping out onto you, just continually remember to take that back to God, to lay it at Jesus' feet, because God will remind you who you are in him, but he'll also help you put on those grace glasses and begin to see the brokenness in others. And when you begin to see that, you can begin to take action. And so that's really what the second part of this video comes down to, is what is the action plan that I can take? Well, number one, I can ask God to protect my heart, to continually remind me who I am in him, so that the symptoms of brokenness around me don't have the power to either define me, wrap me up in labels of insecurity, but it also doesn't have the power to pour anger into me, and to a point that it begins to take root and pour out onto others. Because remember, brokenness, anger, those, not brokenness in itself, but the symptoms of brokenness like anger and resentment, those things are like a virus, and they do have the power to seep onto others and then take root in those people and then seep onto others. And it begins like a negative pay it forward. And, so we want to immediately take our hearts to Jesus and say, please remind me who I am in you. Continually remind me this. But then the second point of that is, again, asking God to help us put on those grace goggles. So then our prayer becomes two very different things, because now we have slapped on the armor of God. We have asked God to protect us, just like David, right? We're letting God protect us. And then we are running into battle. Okay, we're shedding our own personal armor, like we talked about before. We're shedding the anger. We're shedding the resentment. We don't need those things. It's heavy. We're asking God to protect us, and then we are running into battle. That is our action plan. So running into battle means that we are taking up arms for the person that we love that is traveling through this tremendous season of brokenness. So if you have someone that is literally, their brokenness is seeping out onto you in the form of just pain and anger that's being directed towards you, and you could see past those symptoms and see the brokenness inside, you can literally ask God to help you stand between them and the enemy, take up the arms of prayer, and tell the enemy he has no grounds to be in your loved one's life, that he does not have the authority to take over their life, that you are standing between him and that person, and you are covering them in God's prayer. And that's the second part of the battle that I will say. You go into that battle and you pray every day that God just pours his peace, his grace, his love over that person, that he just continually walks them through their own season of healing, that he continually reminds them how beautiful they are, and that they are loved by a Father that loves them more than anything. Because the truth is, when we look at them with our, let's say, human eyes, we may look at them and just feel emotions that we feel are fully justified. And maybe they are, but that's not how God sees them. And only God has the power to define them. And God loves them more than we could possibly imagine. So we are choosing to see past the symptoms of their brokenness and to stand in the gap between them and the enemy, but also to pray to God to just pour out over them and let that journey be between them and God. Because the truth is, there's a lot of times in that person may not be ready to hear that you are standing in the gap, that you are praying over them daily. They may not be in a space that they're ready to hear that, but God hears that. God hears that, and he is continually pouring into them. And that person may absolutely know, they may be able to feel it in their spirit that you are praying over them. But we don't necessarily need to make an announcement about it or tell them. We just go and we run into battle and we commit to being an intercessor for them, that we are praying to God on their behalf, and we commit to being a warrior with them, a spiritual warrior standing between them and the enemy, and we are fighting their battles for them. Because I guarantee you, if they are in a space in their life, much like all of us have been, where they feel weak, they feel powerless against the enemy, they feel crushed, they feel defeated, they feel angry, if they are in that space, then they probably feel like that they're struggling to fight the battle any longer. And you are committing to take up arms and say, you can rest in Jesus. I'll fight the battle for you right now. I'm going to stand right here between you and the enemy while you rest. And I'm going to fight. I'm going to fight and tell the enemy he has no space. And you are committing to do that. And the only way you can truly commit to do that is by being able to pour grace over them that is beyond even your own understanding. It's beyond even your ability to comprehend that you can pour that kind of grace over someone. But if the very first action you take is to go to God and ask him to pour that into you, he will be faithful to help you through. And then you are basically joining hand in hand to walk this person and yourself through healing, through chasing Jesus, through joy, through hope. You are walking hand in hand together through this season, and that person is no longer alone. And let me tell you, if you remember what it's like to walk through a season of devastation, to walk through a wilderness, some of the worst parts about it are that feeling of being alone. But you are telling that person, you are not alone. I am here with you. I am standing by you. I am fighting for you. I'm with you, and so is God. And it's just incredible to watch what God can do in that space. So the second part of this video is really just about that action plan and just about how, God can truly help us see things in a whole different light, and he can walk us through that season of not only our own healing, our own growth, our own breaking out of our shell, our own trusting in him, but how we can stand in a gap for others, for people we love, and help them walk through their difficult season as well. That we don't have to take the brokenness around us and allow it to break our journey, to hinder our journey, to hurt our journey, but rather we can turn that whole situation around, and we can allow it to, as we run this race to healing, reach out and grab that person we love and pull them into the journey with us, and they can chase their own healing through Jesus. So that's really what I wanted to share with you with part 2 of chapter 6. I really hope that has encouraged and inspired your spirit. I know that most, if not all of us, can think of someone in our lives that is just traveling through a difficult season, and maybe in their brokenness it's seeping or it's vomiting out onto others. And through prayer and through asking God to really just pour into our hearts an understanding that's beyond something that we imagine on our own, we can begin to put on our grace goggles. We can begin to see their heart through his eyes, that those are symptoms of their brokenness, and those are not things that have the power to define who they are, because they are who God says they are, and they are beautiful and loved, and they are irreplaceable and priceless to him. They are valued and treasured. And instead of rejecting them because it's pouring out, rejecting them because we're on our own journey of healing and we're keeping ourselves focused here, we can instead open up our eyes, take them by the hand, and pull them with us. So that is it for chapter 16 And I did want to mention real quick right here at the end that if you noticed at the very beginning of this video, there was a crown on the title. That's because this video had to do with our identity in God. Back when we did our first video that included a crown, I talked about that I was working on a piece of prophetic art that had to do with a lion, and God is a lion, and God protecting us and standing behind us and saying, mine, she is mine, and roaring that he loves us. And I just wanted to let you know I finished that piece. I wanted to share with you what it looked like. So I will drop it at the end of this video. And last but not least, join us back for chapter 17, where we are going to be talking about the head bones connected to the heart bone. So it really talks about how our thoughts have the power to water things in our heart, and how we really want to be mindful of what we're watering, and how God can really walk us through that. So you guys have a great day. I will see you back here. Bye.